In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory, a lone woman's world was defined by silence and survival. The law of the land was simple: trust no one and report anything suspicious to the soldiers at Fort Grant. But when a ferocious storm drove a wounded Navajo fugitive to her doorstep, Lily Foster was faced with a choice that defied the law. The soldiers called him a criminal. Her heart called him a man in need. By nightfall, the man the entire U.S. cavalry was hunting was hidden beneath her floorboards, his fate held entirely in her hands, and a single mistake would cost them both their lives. The sky over the Chiricahua foothills had been the color of a bad bruise all afternoon. Lily Foster, a woman forged as tough as the parched earth around her cabin, knew the signs. She'd spent the last hour securing anything that the wind might decide to claim as its own: the loose shutter on the west window, the stack of firewood, the heavy lid on the water barrel. Her late husband, Thomas, had taught her to read the weather like a book. It was a bitter legacy, one of the few useful things he'd left her, besides a remote, solitary patch of land, and a profound understanding of loneliness. The cabin was small, a single room of sturdy pine that smelled perpetually of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the lye soap she made herself. It was her fortress against a world that had taken everything else. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement of Wilcox, a person was an island, and the approaching storm was a hungry ocean. As the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the packed dirt of her yard, she heard it. It wasn't the wind, which was already beginning to howl a mournful prelude. It was a sound that didn't belong, a low groan, almost lost in the rising gale. Human. Her hand went instantly to the worn stock of the Winchester rifle resting by the door. In this territory, an unexpected sound was rarely a welcome one. It could be a prospector who'd lost his way, but it was just as likely to be an outlaw, or worse, a squad of Apache raiders who still haunted these mountains despite the army's best efforts. She peered through the window, her knuckles white on the frame. The world outside was a grey, wind-swept blur. The sound came again, closer this time, from the cluster of granite boulders that sheltered the northern side of her cabin. It was a sound of pure agony. Caution warred with a compassion she thought had long since withered. Caution told her to bar the door and wait for the storm to pass. Compassion, a stubborn weed in the garden of her heart, urged her forward. With the heavy rifle in her hands, Lily unlatched the door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her calico dress and whipped strands of her brown hair across her face. Rain, now cold and hard, soaked her in seconds. She moved slowly, her boots sinking into the fast softening ground, keeping the boulders between her and whatever lay beyond. She rounded the largest rock and stopped dead. There, slumped at its base, was a man. He was Navajo, that much was clear from his high cheekbones, the turquoise amulet half hidden beneath his torn shirt, and the long black hair matted with rain, and something darker. He was wearing buckskin leggings and a settler's cotton shirt that was stained crimson down one side. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged affair. He was bleeding from a wound in his side, a bullet hole by the look of it. Panic seized her. This was not just a stranger. This was a fugitive. The soldiers from Fort Grant, led by the relentless Sergeant Jedediah Thorne, had been sweeping the territory for weeks, hunting for a Navajo brave, accused of stealing army horses and killing a corporal. They had posters in Wilcox with a crude drawing and a name, Kyle. The reward was $100 a fortune to a woman like her. The penalty for harboring him was a noose. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep-set, and filled not with menace, but with a desperate, animalistic fear. He tried to push himself up to scramble away, but a fresh wave of pain contorted his features, and he collapsed back with a sharp hiss. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to go back inside, bolt the door and pretend she had seen nothing. The law was the law. Sergeant Thorne was a hard man, but he was a fair one, and he represented order in a land that craved it. To help this man was to declare war on that order. But as she looked at him, shivering and bleeding out at the foot of the rock, she didn't see the monster from the wanted posters. She saw a man no older than she was, dying in the rain. She saw the same desperation she had seen in Thomas's eyes as the fever took him. She saw a life on the verge of being extinguished, and something within her, something she couldn't name, refused to let it happen. "Can you stand?" she asked, her voice nearly snatched away by the wind. He stared at her, his eyes uncomprehending a flicker of suspicion in their depths. He didn't understand her words. She holstered her rifle over her shoulder and knelt beside him, grimacing at the smell of wet buckskin and blood. She pointed to herself. Lily. Then she pointed to her cabin, its single window glowing with the warm, inviting light of her lantern. "Come." He watched her, his gaze unwavering. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, that his pride or his fear would keep him rooted to the spot. Then, with a monumental effort that made him gasp, he nodded weakly. Getting him to the cabin was a brutal struggle. He was lean but wiry, and a dead weight against her smaller frame. The 50 feet from the rocks to her door felt like a mile. The rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the ground to slick mud. Twice they slipped and nearly fell. His pained grunts and her own strained breathing were the only sounds between the roaring wind and the crashing thunder. Finally, they stumbled through the doorway. She kicked the door shut against the storm and threw the heavy bar into place. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and their own ragged breaths. The man, Kyle, slid down the rough-hewn wood of the door and slumped onto the floor, leaving a muddy, bloody smear in his wake. He was conscious, but just barely. Lily stood over him, her chest heaving rain and sweat dripping from her face. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows across the room, making the small space feel both like a sanctuary and a cage. What have I done? The question echoed in the sudden quiet of her mind. She had invited the very danger she'd spent 2 years avoiding right into the heart of her home. The storm raged outside, but a far more dangerous one had just begun within the 4 walls of her cabin. The barred door shut out the storm, but it sealed in the terror. Lily stood for a moment, the cold reality of her decision seeping into her bones. On her floor lay a wanted man, bleeding from a soldier's bullet. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind sounded like the approach of Sergeant Thorne's patrol. She shook herself free of the paralysis. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. First the wound. "I need to see it," she said, more to herself than to him. She knelt down her movements, cautious, as if approaching a cornered wolf. Kyle watched her, his dark eyes narrowed with pain and mistrust. When she reached for the hem of his torn shirt, his hand shot out and gripped her wrist. His touch was surprisingly strong, a coil of desperate energy. It wasn't violent, but it was a clear warning. Lily met his gaze, holding it steadily. She kept her own hands open and slow. "I won't hurt you," she said softly, enunciating each word. "The bullet must come out." She mimed digging at her own side with her fingers, then pointed to his wound. He stared at her face, searching for deceit. What he saw, or what she hoped he saw, was not pity, but a grim, practical resolve. After a long, tense moment, his grip loosened, and his hand fell away. It was a concession, a fragile offering of trust. With a deep breath, she carefully tore the fabric of his shirt away from the wound. It was worse than she'd feared. The entry point was a ragged, angry hole just above his hip, oozing dark blood. The bullet was still inside. If it wasn't removed, the fever would take him before any soldier could. "Stay still," she commanded, pushing a rolled-up blanket under his head. She moved with an efficiency born of necessity. She stoked the fire until it blazed, casting a warm, flickering light that fought back the shadows. She put a pot of water on to boil and laid out the tools of her grim trade on a clean cloth, a small, sharp knife her husband had used for skinning a pair of pliers, a bottle of whiskey, and the clean linen strips she'd been saving. When she returned with the whiskey and the sterilized knife, she saw he had dragged himself into a sitting position against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. "This will hurt," she said, her voice devoid of everything but the hard truth. She held out the whiskey bottle. "Drink." He eyed it suspiciously, then uncorked it with his teeth, and took a long, shuddering swallow. He coughed the raw spirit catching in his throat, but he didn't flinch. He handed the bottle back, his eyes locking onto the knife in her hand. He gave a single curt nod. He was ready. Lily steeled herself. She had set broken bones in lambs and stitched up her own hand after a mishap with an axe, but this was different. This was a man's life under her trembling fingers. She took a swig of the whiskey herself, the fire of it burning a path down her throat and giving her a fleeting false courage. She knelt, poured a little of the whiskey over the wound to clean it, and ignored his sharp intake of breath. "Hold on," she whispered, and then she began to cut. The next 10 minutes were a blur of focused horror. The cabin was filled with the metallic scent of blood, the sharp sting of whiskey, and Kyle's grunts of suppressed agony. He never cried out, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the floorboards and sweat poured down his temples. Lily worked with a surgeon's intensity, probing, searching her world, narrowed to the small, bloody field of her work. Finally, she felt the knife scrape against metal. Using the pliers, she latched onto the misshapen lump of lead and with a final sickening pull, drew it free. It clattered into the metal basin with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Kyle sagged against the wall, his eyes rolling back in his head. For a terrifying second, she thought she'd lost him, but his chest still rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. He was alive. She worked quickly now, cleaning the wound once more, packing it with a poultice of yarrow she kept for stopping bleeding and binding it tightly with the clean linen. When she was done, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. She used what was left of the warm water to clean the blood from his skin and from her floorboards. Evidence. Everything was evidence. She burned the bloody rags in the fireplace, the flames consuming the proof of her crime. She managed to help him onto her own narrow cot, the only bed in the cabin. He was lapsing into a fever-induced delirium, murmuring words in his own tongue, the language of the Diné. The words were soft, rhythmic, and strangely beautiful. As the night deepened and the storm settled into a steady, relentless drumming on the roof, Lily sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap. She watched the man on her cot, a stranger whose life was now inextricably tied to her own. His name was Kyle, according to the poster. She wondered about his family, his home, the life that had led him to bleed out in the rain near her cabin. Sometime after midnight, she must have dozed off. She was awoken by a new sound, one that cut through the rhythm of the rain. Hoofbeats, faint but distinct and getting closer. Her heart leapt into her throat. Soldiers. She shot to her feet, her mind racing. They couldn't find him. They couldn't. The cot was too obvious. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. There was nowhere to hide a grown man. Then her eyes fell upon the braided rag rug in the center of the room. Beneath it was the trap door to the root cellar. It was small, dusty, and filled with sacks of potatoes and jars of preserves, but it was concealed. It was the only chance they had. She rushed to Kyle's side. "Wake up," she hissed, shaking his shoulder. "You have to wake up." Soldiers. The word soldiers seemed to penetrate his fevered haze. His eyes snapped open, a flicker of lucid fear cutting through the confusion. He understood. "The cellar," she said, pointing to the floor. "Quickly." He tried to move, but a fresh wave of agony from his side made him cry out, a sharp, guttural sound he instantly stifled. He couldn't get there on his own. With adrenaline surging through her veins, Lily half lifted, half dragged him off the cot. The movement must have been excruciating, but he didn't make another sound, his jaw clenched tight against the pain. Together they staggered to the center of the room. She threw back the rug, grasped the iron ring of the trapdoor, and pulled. The air that rose from the cellar was cool and smelled of damp earth. Below was a dark, cramped space. She helped him lower himself into the opening, his body trembling with exertion and fever. Just as his feet touched the cellar floor, the hoofbeats stopped directly outside her cabin. A loud, authoritative voice cut through the night. "Mrs. Foster, open up U.S. Cavalry." It was Sergeant Thorne. Kyle looked up at her from the darkness below his eyes, wide in the lantern light. Lily placed a finger to her lips, then gently lowered the heavy wooden door, plunging him into blackness. She slid the rug back over it, smoothing the edges with a trembling foot, and took a deep, steadying breath. A heavy fist pounded on her door. "Mrs. Foster, I know you're in there." She walked to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took one last look around the cabin, praying she hadn't missed a single drop of blood. Then, schooling her face into a mask of sleepy annoyance, she lifted the bar. The door swung open to reveal Sergeant Jedediah Thorne, a man who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the mountains around them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes the color of a winter sky. Rain dripped from the brim of his campaign hat, and the yellow torchlight from his men cast dancing demonic shadows behind him. Two other soldiers sat on their horses, carbines held ready, their faces grim and wary. Sergeant Lily said, feigning a yawn and pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, "You'll wake the dead with that racket. Is something wrong?" Thorne's gaze swept past her, meticulously scanning every corner of her small cabin. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "There's a storm, ma'am, and a fugitive. We're checking on all the homesteads in the area. You seen anyone tonight? A Navajo wounded, likely. Goes by the name Cale." Every nerve in Lily's body screamed. Beneath the very floorboards, she stood on the man he sought, was lying wounded, likely listening to every word. She forced a calm she was far from feeling. "No one but me and the wind sergeant. I've been shuttered up tight since dusk." She leaned against the doorframe, trying to appear relaxed, casual. A wounded man wouldn't have made it far in this deluge. Thorne grunted, not entirely convinced. He's resourceful. And desperate. "Mind if we come in and take a look around, just to be sure?" It wasn't a question. Lily's heart hammered, but she forced a tight smile. "If you must. But there's not much to see. It's just me." She stepped aside, making a show of hospitality she didn't feel. "Can I offer you some coffee? It's still warm on the stove." "No thank you, ma'am." Thorne stepped inside his muddy boots, leaving dark prints on her clean floor. He was followed by a younger, skinnier corporal whose eyes darted around nervously. The cabin, which had always felt like her private sanctuary, suddenly felt claustrophobic and violated. Thorn began his search. It was methodical, efficient, and terrifyingly thorough. He peered under her cot, his torchlight illuminating the empty space. He checked the small wardrobe where her few dresses hung. He ran a hand along the shelves of canned goods. Lily stood by the fire, her arms crossed, forcing herself to watch with an air of detached patience. She could feel Kyle's presence beneath her feet, a silent, pulsing weight. She imagined his shallow breathing, his effort to remain perfectly still, despite his pain and fever. The sergeant paused, his eyes landing on the hearth. He nudged the ashes with the toe of his boot. Fires burning hot for a woman alone on a night like this. He observed his voice, casual, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "I was cold, Sergeant," she replied smoothly. "The damp gets in my bones." He nodded slowly, his gaze moving across the floor. It stopped on the rag rug in the center of the room. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "That's a new rug," he said. "Don't recall seeing it last time I passed through. My old one was worn through." She lied, her mind racing. "I finished braiding this one last week." He walked over to it, his boots falling heavy just inches from the trapdoor's edge. He stood there for a long moment, staring down at the colorful coiled fabric. Lily was sure he could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She prayed Cale wasn't shifting, wasn't groaning in his fevered state. Thorn bent down. Lily braced herself, her hand inching towards the fireplace poker. But instead of lifting the rug, he simply ran his hand over the fabric. "Good tight work," he commented, straightening up. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You're a long way out here by yourself, Mrs. Foster. It's a dangerous place for a woman alone." "I manage," she said, her voice a little too tight. "I'm sure you do." He walked back to the door, the corporal scurrying behind him. He paused on the threshold and turned back to her, his face half in shadow. "If you do see anything at all, you send word to the fort. Kyle is not some misunderstood brave. He killed a good man, Corporal Davies, left a wife and 2 young children behind. Don't you forget that." The words hit her like a physical blow. A wife and children. Could the man in her cellar be capable of such a thing? She looked at the sergeant's earnest, weary face and felt a pang of guilt. "I'll remember, Sergeant," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a final sharp nod. "Good night, ma'am." She watched them mount their horses and disappear into the rain-swept darkness. Only when the sound of their hoofbeats had completely faded did she bar the door again, her knees feeling weak. She leaned against it, her forehead pressed to the cool wood, and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her deception. She had lied to a federal officer, obstructed justice, and harbored a man accused of murder. And Sergeant Thorn, for all his thoroughness, had bought it. For now. But as she stood there, a cold dread crept over her. He hadn't lifted the rug. Why had he truly seen nothing to arouse his suspicion? Or was he smarter than that? Perhaps he was leaving her thinking she would lead him to his quarry. He had said he'd be checking on the homesteads, which meant he would be back. The danger wasn't over. It had just been given a name and a face. She moved to the center of the room and threw back the rug. Lifting the heavy trap door, she held her lantern over the opening. Kyle was looking up at her, his face a pale oval in the darkness. He had a small, sharp rock in his hand, ready to be used as a weapon. He hadn't been waiting for rescue. He had been preparing for a fight. He saw the question in her eyes. In slow, halting English, his voice raspy from fever and disuse, he spoke for the first time. "Not kill, soldier," he whispered. "They lie." Lily stared down at him, the lantern light flickering between them. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside her cabin, the true tempest was just gathering force. She had to decide who to believe, the lawman with the honest eyes or the fugitive murderer hiding in her cellar. For 2 days, the world was the size of the cabin. Lily kept Kyle hidden in the root cellar, a space so cramped he could not stand upright. The risk of Sergeant Thorne doubling back was too great. She brought him water broth and fresh bandages, lowering them into the earthy darkness. Each time she lifted the trap door, she was met with the same pair of watchful, intense eyes. He said little and she asked nothing. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions and shared fear. His fever raged. In his delirium, he spoke in the flowing, musical tones of the Diné language. She would sit on the floor above, listening to the cadence of his voice, wondering what ghosts he was wrestling with in the dark. She would cool his forehead with damp cloths, her touch gentle but brief, always pulling back as if from a flame. She was his caretaker, not his confidant. It was a line she was determined not to cross. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. When she opened the trap door, his eyes were clear, the haunted glaze of sickness gone. The soldiers he rasped his first lucid words in days. "They're gone." "For now," she replied, "but they'll be back. You need to get your strength." That afternoon, she helped him out of the cellar. He was weak, unsteady on his feet, and leaned heavily on her as she guided him to the cot. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with necessity, and everything to do with a long-dormant human connection. She dismissed it as quickly as it came. With the immediate danger past, a new kind of tension settled in. They were two strangers from warring worlds, trapped in an intimate space. They began to communicate in a clumsy patchwork of gestures, his broken English, and the few Navajo words she knew from trading. She learned his name was indeed Kale. He learned hers was Lily. He pointed to the herbs she had used on his wound and said their name in his tongue Azi. She pointed to the coffee pot, and he eventually managed the word, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines of pain and suspicion. One afternoon, as she was mending a tear in his buckskin leggings, she noticed the network of scars on his hands and forearms. Some were pale and silvery, with age others more recent. How she asked, tracing a long, thin scar on his wrist with her finger. He pulled his hand back slightly, then seemed to reconsider. He used his other hand to mime the act of roping a horse, the rope pulling tight, burning the skin. He pointed to another, a puckered circle on his shoulder. "Bayesh," he said. "Arrow." Then he turned his arm over. On the inside of his forearm was a brand, a simple C. It was the mark of Silas Croft, a cattle baron from the south, whose ranch was notorious for its brutal treatment of native laborers. He saw the look on her face. Croft, he said the name, a venomous hiss. He tapped his chest. "My people. Our land." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand. Then he made a fist and pointed at the brand. Croft takes. Piece by piece the story emerged. Kyle's small clan had lived in a canyon with a natural spring land that had been theirs for generations. But Silas Croft wanted the water for his ever-expanding herds. He had tried to force them out, and when they resisted, he'd used his influence. The stolen army horses had been found on the edge of Kale's people's land. The dead corporal had been investigating. Kale insisted it was a convenient way for Croft to have the army remove the Indian problem for him. Thorne. He believes Croft Kale finished his voice heavy with a fatalistic certainty. Always believe the white man with money. Lily listened, her needle still. It was a story she had heard whispered in town, a familiar tale of greed and injustice. Sergeant Thorne wasn't a corrupt man, but he was a man of his time, one who saw the world in a clear-cut way. Settlers were progress, and Indians were an obstacle to it. To show him she understood, she shared a piece of her own story. She pointed to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece, a serious-looking man with a stiff collar and hopeful eyes. "Thomas," she said. "My husband." She then made a gesture of coughing of a body growing weak. Fever. 2 winters passed. He looked from the photograph to her, his gaze softening with an understanding that transcended language. He saw not just a widow, but a fellow survivor. In this harsh land loss was the one dialect everyone spoke fluently. A fragile trust began to grow in the quiet spaces between them. He taught her how to set a snare that never failed. She read to him from the leather-bound book of poems her mother had given her, not because he understood the words, but because the rhythm of her voice seemed to soothe him. One evening, he took a small piece of scrap wood and her skinning knife. For hours he sat by the fire, his hands once bound by Croft's men, now moving with a delicate, practiced grace. As she banked the fire for the night, he held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing. She ran her thumb over the smooth wood, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. It was the first gift she had received in years. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "For you," he said. "Dolly. Bluebird. For kindness." She closed her hand around the carving, the wood warm against her palm. In that moment, he was not a fugitive, and she was not his jailer. They were just a man and a woman in a small cabin, finding a sliver of peace in a world determined to tear them apart. The line she had drawn between them had blurred, and she was no longer sure where it had been, or if she even wanted to find it again. Kyle grew stronger each day. The wound in his side was healing cleanly, a testament to Lily's care. The color returned to his face, and the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a quiet intensity. He began to move around the cabin with a silent, graceful purpose, chopping firewood with an efficiency that amazed her, reinforcing the loose hinge on the door. His presence transforming the small space from a lonely shelter into a shared home. The easy rhythm they had fallen into was a dangerous illusion, and they both knew it. He could not stay. Every day he remained put her in greater peril. "I must go soon," he said one evening, his voice low. They were sitting at her small table, the carved bluebird between them. "To the mountains. Find my people. Warn them about Croft." Lily's heart clenched at the thought. The idea of the cabin returning to its hollow silence was suddenly unbearable. "You're not strong enough yet." She argued the words a flimsy excuse. "Another week. Another week brings Thorne back." He countered gently, his gaze unwavering. "You have done too much for me already, Lily. I will not see you hang for it." His words were a cold slap of reality. Before she could reply, they were interrupted by the frantic barking of a dog. It was Old Man Hemlock's hound, a creature that never made a sound unless a stranger was approaching on the trail from town. Panic flared in Lily's eyes. "Thorne," she breathed. No-Kale said, his head cocked, listening intently. "One horse." Moving slow, he disappeared into the root cellar without another word, Lily securing the trap door and rug, just as a rider came into view. It wasn't Sergeant Thorne. The man was stout, dressed in a fine but dusty suit, and sat atop a magnificent black stallion whose tack was inlaid with silver. His face was florid, his eyes small and shrewd. Lily recognized him instantly from his visits to Wilcox, where he threw his money around like a king. It was Silas Croft, A wave of cold dread washed over her. Croft never came this far into the foothills. His presence here could not be a coincidence. He reined in his horse a few feet from her door, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Mrs. Foster, is it?" "It is," Lily said, her voice steady as she held the Winchester loosely at her side. "What business do you have here, mister?" "Croft just checking on my neighbors," he said, his tone oozing a false cordiality. "Heard Thorne and his boys were sniffing around here a few days ago. Figured I'd see if you were all right. A woman all alone, you can't be too careful. There are savages about." The word savages was aimed like a poisoned dart. Lily felt a surge of anger. "I'm fine, Mr. Croft. The sergeant was just doing his duty. Of course, of course." Croft swung down from his horse, moving with a surprising agility for a man of his bulk. He walked closer, his eyes scanning her property, lingering on the woodpile, which was now stacked far higher than a lone woman would normally manage. "Thing is, Mrs. Foster, that a Navajo they're hunting Cale. He used to work for me. Ungrateful cur. Stole from me before he went and killed that soldier. I have a personal interest in seeing him brought to justice." He was probing, watching her reaction. Lily kept her face a stony mask. "I haven't seen anyone." "I told the sergeant as much." "I'm sure you did," Croft said, stepping even closer until he was standing on the edge of the braided rug. The floorboards beneath his feet were the only thing separating him from the man he was describing. But desperate men do desperate things. A lonely cabin, a pretty woman. It could be a tempting place to hide. His gaze dropped from her face to her throat, and for the first time, Lily felt a genuine personal fear. This man was not just greedy. He was a predator. "If you're quite finished, Mr. Croft, I have chores to do," she said, her voice cold as ice. He laughed, a short, unpleasant bark. "Spirited. I like that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table where it landed with a dull clink of coins. "That's $25. A bonus, on top of the Army's reward. For your trouble should you happen to remember seeing anything at all. It was a bribe and a threat." "I have nothing to remember," she said, pushing the pouch back towards him with the barrel of her rifle. "Now get off my land." Croft's amiable mask vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury. His eyes narrowed to slits. "You'd be wise to reconsider, Mrs. Foster. This can be a very unforgiving country for those who choose the wrong side." He snatched the pouch from the table, turned on his heel without another word, and mounted his horse. He rode away, but not before casting one last, long, speculative look at the cabin, his gaze lingering on the cellar door's location, as if he could see right through the floor. Lily stood frozen until he was out of sight, her knuckles white on the rifle. The casual encounter had been anything but. It was a warning shot. Croft suspected something. He hadn't come to inquire. He had come to confirm, to see her face, to plant the seeds of greed and fear. She opened the trapdoor. Kyle was already standing, his own face, a grim thundercloud. He had heard everything. He knows, Kyle said, his voice flat. He does not know for sure, but he feels it. A man like Croft trusts his gut. "What do we do?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "He will not wait for you to remember," Kyle said, climbing out of the cellar. He moved to the window, peering out at the trail Croft had taken. "He will go to Thorne. He will tell him he is certain I am here. He will invent a reason, a piece of evidence. A footprint he saw, a glimpse of a shadow in the window. Anything. Thorne will have no choice but to come back, and this time he will not leave until he has torn this cabin apart." The fragile sanctuary had been breached. The vulture was circling, and he was about to lead the wolves right to their door. They were out of time. The air in the cabin grew thick with a suffocating tension. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bloody fingers of light across the valley, Kyle heard it first. The distant, rhythmic beat of shod horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace. More than a patrol this time. A squadron. "They are here," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, cornered light. He grabbed the rifle he had taken from the dead corporal, a weapon he had kept hidden in the cellar, and checked its action. Lily's mind raced. Flight was impossible. The cabin was surrounded by open ground on 3 sides. By now, soldiers would be positioned in the rocks behind them, cutting off any escape into the mountains. They were in a trap. "Kyle, I can talk to him," she said desperately. "I can tell Thorne that Croft is lying, that he threatened me, and Thorne will ask why a man like Croft would do such a thing." Kyle interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "He will ask more questions, and your lies will unravel. No, Lily, there is no more talking." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of regret and fierce resolve. "This is my fight. Give me up. Tell them I forced you. You will be safe." "No." She shot back, her fear instantly replaced by a defiant anger. "I will not. We are in this together." The command from outside was sharp and clear. "Kyle, this is Sergeant Thorne of the United States Army. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands empty. The woman will not be harmed if you surrender now." Silas Croft's voice followed, smug and triumphant. "It's over, you savage. There's nowhere left to run." Kyle glanced at Lily. A silent, profound communication passed between them. It was a look of shared fate, of a bond forged in secrets and sealed in peril. He would not surrender to be hanged on the word of a liar. And she would not abandon him. The floor, Kyle said, his mind working quickly. He pointed to the weakest part of the cabin's foundation, on the side, away from the door, where winter damp had rotted one of the base logs. "The dirt beneath is soft. We can dig." It was a desperate, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. While Kale took up a position at the window, using the small crack between the shutter and the frame as a peephole, Lily grabbed the iron fireplace shovel. She pried at the floorboards, the screech of protesting nails sounding impossibly loud. "You have 1 minute to comply," Kale Thorne yelled. "After that, we are coming in." Lily worked frantically, her muscles straining. She ripped 2 boards free, revealing the dark, packed earth beneath. She began to dig, scooping out handfuls of dirt, her hands raw and bleeding. Kyle watched the soldiers deploying. They are moving to the front. All of them. Croft is with them. He wants to see. He turned from the window. "Now, Lily. Go now. Crawl under the back wall. The creek bed is 20 yards from there. Follow it into the rocks. Do not stop." "What about you?" she cried, her face smudged with dirt. "I will give them something to watch," he said. He touched the carved bluebird on the mantel, then looked at her, his eyes full of a message she couldn't bear to read. It felt like goodbye. "Go." Just as she scrambled into the shallow trench, she had dug the front door of the cabin, splintered, shattered by the butt of a rifle. Kyle didn't wait. He kicked over the table, sending it crashing to the floor as a makeshift barricade. He fired a single shot from his rifle, not at the door, but through the window on the far side of the cabin. The sound of the gunshot, followed by the shattering of glass, was the diversion they needed. The soldiers outside yelled their attention, drawn to the wrong side. Now Kale roared. Lily didn't hesitate. She crawled through the narrow space under the rotted log, the damp earth cold against her skin. She emerged behind the cabin, shielded from view. Keeping low, she scurried towards the shallow, rock-strewn arroyo that cut through her property. Inside the cabin, Chaos erupted. Soldiers stormed through the broken door. Kyle, instead of fighting, did the last thing they expected. He threw his rifle down and held up his empty hands. But as they rushed him, he lunged for the fireplace, grabbed the heavy iron poker, and with a powerful swing, struck the main support beam of the hearth. At the same time, he kicked the lantern off its hook. It shattered on the floor, the oil igniting instantly. Flames exploded upwards, catching on the dry timber and the herbs hanging from the rafters. Sergeant Thorne and his men recoiled, choking on the thick, acrid smoke. The cabin Lily's home was turning into a funeral pyre. Through the smoke and chaos, Kyle dove headfirst through the very window he had just shot out, rolling as he hit the ground. Lily watched in horror from the creek bed. She saw Kyle land, stagger to his feet, and start running for the rocks directly towards her position. But he was limping his wounded side, screaming in protest. Silas Croft, who had been watching from horseback, saw his prize escaping. With a roar of fury, he spurred his horse forward, cutting Kyle off. He drew a pistol, his face a mask of rage. "You're not getting away." But Sergeant Thorne, emerging from the burning cabin, had seen enough. He had seen Kyle's willingness to surrender to protect the woman. He had seen him disarm himself before creating the diversion. And now he saw the naked murderous hatred in Croft's eyes. The neat story of a thieving killer savage was falling apart. "Croft, hold your fire. He's to be taken alive," Thorne commanded. Croft ignored him. He leveled his pistol at Kyle's back. In that split second, everything changed. Lily rose from the creek bed. The Winchester she'd grabbed on instinct pressed to her shoulder. She didn't think. She just acted. She fired. The shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed at the silver concho on Croft's saddle. The bullet screamed past Croft's ear, ricocheting off the metal with a high-pitched zing. His prized stallion reared in terror, screaming and throwing the heavy man to the ground. Croft's pistol discharged harmlessly into the sky. Every soldier froze their attention, snapping to the woman standing defiantly in the arroyo, her rifle smoking. Kyle used the moment. He reached the creek bed, grabbed Lily's hand, and pulled her down behind the rocks, just as the soldiers recovered their senses. "Hold your fire, Sergeant Thorne," bellowed his voice, cutting through the confusion. He was staring at Silas Croft, who was struggling to get up his face, purple with rage and humiliation. Then he looked at the burning cabin, and finally towards the rocks, where Lily and Kyle had disappeared. The siege was over. The chase had just begun. The mountains swallowed them. Kyle, moving with an instinct born of a lifetime in the wilderness, led Lily through a labyrinth of canyons and game trails that the soldiers' horses could not follow. They moved through the night, the red glow of the burning cabin, a fading ember behind them, a funeral pyre for the life Lily had known. They didn't stop until dawn, when they found shelter in a shallow cave overlooking a vast, empty expanse of desert. Lily sank to the ground, exhausted, her body aching and her mind numb. She had lost everything. Her home, her solitude, her fragile peace. She was now a fugitive, just like the man beside her. Kyle knelt and gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked at her, his face etched with a profound sorrow. "You should not have done that, Lily," he said softly. "You saved me, but you have lost your world. You became my world." She whispered the truth of the words, startling her. In the crucible of the last week, her lonely existence had been burned away, and something new and terrifyingly alive had taken its place. He reached out and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shock wave through her. "What we did, it changes nothing," he said, his voice heavy. "Croft will not rest. Thorne will have to hunt us. There is no place for us." They stayed in the mountains for a week, living off the land. Kyle taught her which roots were safe to eat and how to find water. In the quiet of the wilderness, away from the immediate threat of capture, the walls between them finally crumbled. They shared stories by the small, smokeless fires he built. He spoke of his family, of the green canyon he called home. She spoke of her dreams of seeing the ocean, a dream she had shared with Thomas before he died. One night, as the stars blazed with a cold, fierce light in the clear desert sky, he took her hand. "Lily," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "In my culture, a home is not the wood and nails of a house. It is the person you stand beside. When my world was fire and pain, you were my shelter." He brought her hand to his lips. "You are my home now." She leaned into him, and in the shelter of the ancient rocks, under the silent watch of the stars, their lips met. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching tenderness, a recognition of two lonely souls who had found each other against impossible odds. But the wilderness couldn't hide them forever. They knew Sergeant Thorne was still out there, a patient, relentless hunter. One morning they saw the tracks of a single rider. Not a patrol, but one man. Kyle knew the trail. "He is tracking us, alone." They laid an ambush in a narrow pass. When Thorne appeared, his face weary and grim, he found them waiting there, Kyle with a rifle, Lily with the Winchester. Thorne stopped his horse, holding up an empty hand. "I'm not here to fight. You have a strange way of showing it." Lily said, her voice hard. "Things have changed," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on Cale. "After you escaped, I had a long talk with Silas Croft. He was agitated, made threats. I started asking questions back in Wilcox. Found a stable hand Croft had fired. The boy swore he saw Croft's own ranch hands driving those army horses onto Navajo land the night before the corporal was killed." He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "It seems Croft wanted that spring of yours even more than I thought. He framed you, Kyle, for everything." A stunned silence fell over the canyon. "So you will let us go?" Kyle asked, his rifle unwavering. "It's not that simple," Thorne said grimly. "You're still a fugitive. You resisted arrest. The woman fired on a civilian. My superiors want you both. But—" He looked from Kyle's honorable face to Lily's defiant one. "But I am the only one who knows where you are. I reported that the trail went cold at the base of the mountains." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen and a small sack of food. He tossed them on the ground between them. "Mexico is 3 days south of here," Thorne said, his voice low. "I never saw you. I never found your trail. But if you ever cross back into this territory, I will have to hunt you. Do you understand? It was an act of extraordinary justice, of one man's conscience, winning out over his duty." Kyle lowered his rifle. He gave Thorne a slow, deliberate nod of respect. "You are a man of honor, Sergeant Thorne. I'm just a man who's tired of burying good soldiers for a rich man's greed," Thorne replied. He turned his horse, and without looking back, rode away, his duty fulfilled in a way no regulation would ever recognize. Kyle and Lily watched him go, the dust from his horse's hooves settling in the quiet air. They were free, not pardoned, but given a chance. They turned south. Their journey was long and arduous, but they faced it together. They crossed the border into Mexico. As the sun was setting, two fugitives leaving their pasts behind in a cloud of dust. They found a new life in a small village, where no one knew their story, where a man's worth wasn't measured by the color of his skin, and a woman's courage was her own. Lily never saw the ocean, but she found something better. She found a home, not of wood and nails, but in the arms of a man who had been hunted by soldiers and who had found refuge not just in her cabin, but inside her heart. The story of Lily and Cale is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are the quiet ones, made not on a battlefield, but in the hidden corners of the human heart. It's a story about how one person's choice to show compassion over condemnation can change the course of destiny, proving that true sanctuary is found not in a place, but in another person. Their love born from danger and forged in defiance stands as a testament to the idea that even in the most lawless of times, the laws of the heart are the ones that truly matter. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and forbidden love moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates epic tales from the Old West, and most importantly, subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support allows us to keep bringing these incredible journeys to life. Thank you for listening.